Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me once again, where today we're having a look at a very interesting piece of epidemiology put together by a research team headed by Teresa T. Fung, including a number of individuals, including well-known vegan sympathists such as Walter C. Willett, for example. And this is a paper that purports to inform us on our risk of developing death, basically, of experiencing death, as a result of being sucked in to this ridiculous idea of having a low carbohydrate dietary approach to life. So, opening statements before we get going on the paper, you need to understand that this study, like all epidemiological studies of its kind, are observational studies. What these researchers have done is collect data from a number of respondent individuals over a number of years without intervention. There has been no science undertaken here at all. This is purely a prospective cohort study where they have asked participants of the study on a number of occasions about their dietary intakes using a questionnaire, which the participants have responded to give the researchers supposedly an idea of what the intakes of these participants in the study were dietarily over this period of follow-up. And as such, they have split the overall cohort into a number of sub-cohorts who are placed into decile bins, actually, 1/10 of the population, 1/10 of the population, 1/10 of the population, on the basis of a number of different things regarding their diets, which we'll talk about when we get to the meat and potatoes of the study. On that basis, they have then come up with some outcome statistics of the observations on these individuals over a number of years of follow-up, with regard to how many people in each of those decile bins has died during that period of follow-up and how many have not died. And as such, they have then made statements about risk, even though this is an associative study and associative studies cannot inform on risk. So the word risk is completely inappropriate. We are looking at incidences, is what we're looking at, actually, of mortality, and not controlled incidences of mortality. This is purely observational data, and as such needs to be taken a bit with a grain of salt for that reason alone. But let's actually look at the study, because this is a study that vegetarian, anti-meat eating folks, vegans in particular, like to wave in front of people as being a good indicator that if you avoid carbohydrates in your diet, that will predispose you in some way to being more likely to die. Well, let's see if that's the case, shall we? We'll read through the paper, the important bits of it in our usual fashion, and I shall make my usual stunningly intelligent and incisive commentary along the way. So, let's do that. Okay, the Annals of Internal Medicine, published in 2010, paper entitled Low Carbohydrate Diets and All-Cause and Cause-Specific Mortality. Okay, background. Data on the long-term association between low carbohydrate diets and mortality are sparse. Okay. Objective: to examine the association of low carbohydrate diets with mortality during 26 years of follow-up in women and 20 years in men. Okay. Design: a prospective cohort study of women and men who were followed from 1980 in the case of women or 1986 for men until 2006. Fine. Low carbohydrate diets, either animal-based, emphasizing animal sources of fat and protein, or vegetable-based, emphasizing vegetable sources of fat and protein, were computed from several validated food frequency questionnaires assessed during follow-up. Okay. Setting: Nurses' Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. Okay, so we have a population of people who are qualified nurses and who are doctors, chiropractors, veterinarians, those kind of people. Okay, so not applicable to a general population. This is a specific population, and as such, the results should not be extrapolated to a general population. So there's limitation number 1, glaringly obvious. Okay. Participants: 85,168 women, aged 34 to 59 years at baseline, and 44,548 men, aged 40 to 75 years at baseline, without heart disease, cancer, or diabetes at baseline. Okay. Measurements: investigators documented 12,555 deaths, 2,458 cardiovascular-related, and 5,780 cancer-related in women, and 8,678 deaths, 2,746 cardiovascular-related, and 2,960 cancer-related in men. Okay. Results: the overall low carbohydrate score, limitation number 2, glaringly obvious there, we'll get to it in a minute. The overall low carbohydrate score was associated with a modest increase in overall mortality in a pooled analysis. Hazard ratio, so there's a word hazard or risk, totally inappropriate because this is an associative study. No cause and effect can be informed upon by it. So hazard, not anyway. All right. Hazard ratio, HR, comparing extreme deciles. So first versus 10th on this low carbohydrate score. Okay. 1.12 with a confidence interval 1.01 to 1.24. So possibly as low as 1% differential. Okay. With a probability statement for the trend, which indicates that it is not statistically significant. Okay. The animal low carbohydrate score was associated with higher all-cause mortality. Pooled hazard ratio comparing extreme deciles, 1.23, with a probability statement for that, indicating that it too is not statistically significant, let alone of actual utility, which we'll get to a bit later. Don't worry about it. Okay, interesting. Cardiovascular mortality corresponding hazard ratio, again, is a hazard ratio which only just fails to span 1, and in this case suggests that it is statistically significant. And cancer mortality, same deal, just failing to span 1, but in this case, not statistically significant. Okay. In contrast, a higher vegetable low carbohydrate score was associated with lower all-cause mortality. Hazard ratio given there with huge probability, and cardiovascular mortality, hazard ratio given there, again with massive statistical significance. Goodness me. I wonder what's going on here. We're going to have to read the study to find out, aren't we? Limitations. diet and lifestyle characteristics were assessed with some degree of error. Some degree of error, they say. We'll look at that in a minute. Sensitivity analyses indicated that results were probably not substantively affected by residual confounding or an unmeasured co-founder. I wonder how they justify that claim. Participants were not a representative sample of the US population. So that's the first limitation that I outlined. These are not representative of the population. And as such, this paper should never, even if it was valid and full of veracity in every other way, which, by the way, it isn't, even if it was, this paper should never be used to extrapolate out to a generalized population, therefore. And yet, it is done repeatedly, all the time, by people who like to wave this paper in front of others to attempt to browbeat them into the idea that eating vegetables is a good idea and eating meat is not. So we're going to have to do some digging. We're going to have to follow some rabbit holes here in order to get to the bottom of what the situation really is, aren't we? So let's do that. Let's read the introduction, because often the introduction will give us a clue, if we didn't know already, by the name Walter C. Willett in the authors list, who is a well-known sympathist for veganism. If we didn't know that, we could probably find that out by reading the introduction and seeing whether there's any sign of that in the introduction. In other words, is there bias in these authors at the outset before they even start? Okay, let's have a look. Low carbohydrate diets have been claimed to promote weight loss and improve blood cholesterol levels and blood pressure. Well, they've been established to do exactly that. It's not a claim that's shown in the literature. They do those things. Okay. Weight loss trials lasting 6 months to 2 years have found low carbohydrate diets to be as effective or more effective than diets with higher carbohydrate content. Great. That's true. However, effects on blood lipid profiles for low carbohydrate diets with substantial animal products were mixed, with low carbohydrate diets resulting in greater improvements in high-density lipoprotein cholesterol levels, but possibly less favorable changes in low-density lipoprotein cholesterol levels than higher carbohydrate diets. Okay, so there's an entire assertion based around claims about the likelihood for long-term health outcomes on the basis of lipoprotein subfractions in the blood, all of which are completely inappropriate. Lipoproteins are not causal in heart disease. There is no such thing as good and bad cholesterol, and there is no such thing as blood cholesterol readings which are too high. These are ideas that are from another time. These are ideas that have been scientifically debunked time and time again by many sensible, very well-trained, very experienced experimental researchers, including myself, actually, but not limited to myself. And you can find information about that on my other fine YouTube channel under a playlist simply entitled Cholesterol Videos, where I think there are about 40 or more different videos there where I speak about cholesterol at length scientifically for many, many hours in total. So if you're not aware of that other channel or of that list of videos, do go and make yourselves aware of it. So basically, as usual, the vegan sympathists, the only argument that they can go to is blood lipids. Doesn't pan out. Doesn't work. Invalid claims about the likelihood of health benefits or otherwise on the basis of blood cholesterol levels. So that's a statement of no value. All right, moving on. In addition, these diets can be high in red meat and low in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Okay. Which has been shown to increase risk for chronic diseases? No, it hasn't. There are no long-term metabolic ward lock-in experimental studies with good randomization, good design, good statistical power and good control, which establish any cause and effect relationships of the kind suggested by the authors of this paper in that sentence, which they have suffixed with 3 references 10, 11, and 12, which are all observational studies conducted without good control. That is a misrepresentation of fact. It is a misrepresentation of science. It is scientific misconduct for those authors to make that statement. It is disgraceful behavior. Okay, moving on. In contrast, the Atkins Diet, a low-calorie, low-carbohydrate diet with high amounts of plant protein and oils, has been shown to improve low-density lipoprotein cholesterol levels compared with a high-carbohydrate ovo-lacto-vegetarian diet. Well, again, assertions about health outcomes, likelihood by virtue of blood lipid measurements, invalid. So no value in that statement either. Because the leading causes of death in the United States, cardiovascular disease and cancer, develop over many years, long-term studies of carbohydrate diets are needed to evaluate effects on mortality. No, not effects. Association. Unless you lock people in a lab and control every aspect of their life except for the carbohydrate intake, and you control absolutely everything else, and you observe under control for many years, then we do not establish cause and effect. We establish association, and we have to accept that that is pseudoscience. And that out of that, we have an ideological take on the outcome data such that it is. Okay. However, randomized trials of low-carbohydrate diets on mortality are not feasible because of the difficulty in maintaining adherence and follow-up over many years. There you go. So you can't do the science. We will never be able to do the science. It is not ethical. It is not feasible practically. It is not feasible financially. It cannot be done. It will never be done. Hence, the different factions of the nutrition ideology, I'm not going to say nutrition science because it doesn't exist, nutrition ideology will continue to espouse their ideas ad infinitum, unfortunately. And we will have to continue to put right the errors of the antithesis to whatever we believe. I've been quite clear, I think, over years on my other fine channel as to what my particular position is. If you're unsure of what that is and would like to know, in other words, what are my biases, go and have a look at my other fine channel and my biases will become clear. However, what you will also find is that I back my assertions about the fallacies espoused by others with logic and with reference to the actual empirical data sets on every occasion. All right, good. We previously developed 3 scores to characterize low carbohydrate diets on the basis of the proportion of carbohydrate, fat, and protein in the diet, and the contribution to these macronutrients from animal or vegetable sources. Okay. We found that women with higher low carbohydrate diet scores did not have a greater risk, again, it's not a risk, it's an association, for type 2 diabetes and coronary heart disease. And a low carbohydrate dietary pattern that emphasized vegetable sources of fat and protein was associated with a lower risk, again, no association, for both diseases. So, interesting. However, long-term data on carbohydrate diets and mortality are scarce. 2 European cohorts reported that a low-carbohydrate, high-protein diet was associated with a weak but statistically significant higher mortality rate. These studies included only a few hundred deaths and did not evaluate different sources of proteins and fat. Therefore, we prospectively examined the relationship between different types of low-carbohydrate diets and all-cause and cause-specific mortality in 2 large cohorts in the United States. Fabulous. Okay, so yes, there are clear biases there, especially when you actually get to reading the data in this paper, which, you'll see when we get to it, that the data that is actually presented here does not support the claims made by these authors in the introduction here. Interesting. Okay, so the study population was the NHS Nurses Health Study and also the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. Okay, so we've given the numbers previously on the number of participants there. What they add up to when you look at the number of individual persons in each of those cohorts, multiplied by the number of years those individuals were followed, you get the following. For the nurses study, we have 2,214,368 woman years of follow-up. The cohort. Okay. And in the men, we have 890,960 man years of follow-up, for a total of 3,105,328 person years of follow-up. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. Dietary assessment. Okay, so they've assessed the diets of these people via a questionnaire, which is the first problem because it's not validated. They say it's validated, but actually it's not validated because they have not observed or measured the intakes of the people in this study. They have asked the people what it is they eat. They've written down the answer to what the people have said, and they've believed those people. Well, time and time again, it has been shown that people who are asked about their diets, either because they cannot remember, get it wrong, or they actively lie because they are embarrassed about what they actually do eat. Now, if anyone is going to lie about their intakes of diet, it is going to be nurses and health professionals who supposedly should know better. So what we have here is completely invalid data before we even start. Next, these authors are purporting to be associating or regressing the amount of carbohydrate eaten versus the amount of mortality experienced. Have they measured the amount of carbohydrate consumed by these people? The answer is no. Let's read through this bit. Dietary assessment. Self-administered semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaires were designed to assess average food intake during the preceding year. Okay, so that's rubbish before you even start, isn't it? A standard portion size and 9 possible food frequency categories ranging from never or less than 1 a month to 6 or more times per day were given for each food. So they've asked people, how often do you eat this food? And then they've applied a standard serving size to everybody to suggest how much of carbohydrate or whatever that person has actually consumed, assuming that every person that they give this questionnaire to eats the same amount of that food on every occasion they eat it. Whoops. Big whoops, don't you think? Oh dear. Completely invalid data. In the limitations, they said we measured food intakes with some error. Some error, you say? Oh, okay. Anyway, then they've split people into deciles for low carbohydrate scores on the 3 different scales, the overall low carbohydrate, the low carbohydrate mostly animal-based, and the low carbohydrate mostly plant-based scores. And then they've given us some hazard ratios, which are actually not hazards at all. They are associations. And let's have a look at those, shall we? Okay, results. Right, so in the woman, the median score for low carbohydrate intake was 3 points. And that's for the first decile, and for the 10th decile, 27 points. Okay, so there's a spread there, but we have no idea of the actual intakes. We could read through and find out what they think the intakes were, again, on there, assuming that everybody ate a standard serving size every time, which is fundamentally, utterly ridiculous. And we would see that the energy intake in the first decile of low carbohydrate scores was 1,821 kcals per day, and in the 10th decile, 1,641. Whoops. Confounder. Oh dear. Let's have a look at the animal-based low carbohydrate score. Again, for women, the median for the first decile was a score of 2, and the 10th decile was a score of 28. And we had 1,817 kcals in the first decile and 1,630 in the 10th. Whoops. Let's have a look at the vegetable low carbohydrate score. And in the first decile, we had 1,811 calories in the first decile, and in the 10th decile, 1,748. Whoops. Oh dear. Let's see if the same trend is visible in the men, shall we? Well, in the first decile for overall low carbohydrate, we had a score of 3, and we had 2,012 kcals intaken. In the 10th decile, we had a score of 27, 1,881 calories. Whoops. In the animal-based low carbohydrate score, the first decile was a score of 2, 2,010 calories. The 10th decile was 28 points, 1,867 calories. Whoops. In the vegetable low carbohydrate score, we had a score of 6 in the first decile with 2,012 calories intaken, and in the 10th decile, 24 was the score, and there was 2,034 calories intaken. So that's the only one that didn't follow that trend. So what we have there is an inextricable, unpartitionable covariate, a confounder. See, the thing is, if someone dies in any given 20 or 26-year follow-up period, how do you know how much of the fact that they died was attributable to a lower calorie intake or higher calorie intake, depending on the decile they were in, compared with the others, versus what the makeup of those calories were, as not even assessed with an actual measurement of same, with a guess based on a standard serving size. Oh dear. We seem to have some major problems here, don't we, class? Looks like we do. All right, well, let's move on and see if there's anything else wrong with this study. Okie dokie. Let's look at the hazard ratios, shall we? The hazard ratios, which should be called associations, not hazards, because hazard is completely inappropriate as a term for an observational study. And let's look at the overall low carbohydrate score. And in this case, we're looking first at men. And in the first decile, we have a number of cases of mortality that numbers, over the 20 years, 871 of those men who died. Now, given that deciles are tenths, evenly sized tenths of the entire cohort, that means we have 871 men who have died out of a total population size of 89,096 man-years of follow-up. So let's have a quick calculation on that, shall we? Right, so calculator, here it is. Let's do that, shall we? All right, 871 individuals divided by the total population pool, which is 89,096 man-years of follow-up. We have at baseline in the lowest low carbohydrate score, in other words, the highest carbohydrate intake, which is equal to 0.0097 or 9.7 deaths per 1,000 person-years or man-years of follow-up. So a very, very low incidence of death per man per year. 97 per 10,000, if you like, or 98 to round it up. 98 cases of death per 10,000 person-years of follow-up. Okay, so that's the first little bit of mathematics that we'll be doing. Now let's look at the 10th decile, the highest low carbohydrate score. We have an incidence of 828 deaths. 828 is lower than 871 in the first decile. That is a lower incidence of death, isn't it? At least it was when I went to school. Because, in fact, if we do the same mathematics again, we will see that 828 divided by 89,096 man-years of follow-up is 92 cases per 10,000 person-years of follow-up. So the difference is 5 cases of death per 10,000 years of follow-up. And in the 10th decile, the highest low carbohydrate score, the lowest carbohydrate intake, it's lower. And then we have a look at the hazard ratio, or the risk ratio, if you like, that they have provided here, these authors, and it suggests that in the 10th decile, the lowest carbohydrate intake, the hazard or risk of death is 33%, they say, higher. Despite the fact that what they've actually observed is a rate of mortality which is very, very slightly, in fact, lower. Why? Because they have adjusted the outcome on the basis of age and the energy adjustment that I spoke about before. How do you partition out any of those things as independent causal factors in the risk of death? It cannot be done. There is no way to do it. This is fraudulent data. This is belonging in the fiction section. I'm afraid, boys and girls, the fiction section. Goodness. Okay. What you'll also see if you look at the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th deciles is that the differences in actual incidences as observed of mortality in those populations really do not differ meaningfully from one another from any of those deciles from 1st to 10th because of the vastly low occurrence of death over those 20 years follow-up in those men. It's meaningless. 5 differences over 10,000 years of follow-up from 1st to 10th decile, and the 10th decile, the incidence was lower by 5, not higher. So that's the answer for all the combined low carbohydrate scores in the study that these guys did. So where on earth they get 1.33 as a risk ratio from belies understanding, doesn't it? Other than they've used multivariate regression to artificially adjust the risk ratio on the basis of assuming causality where none has been established for the covariates. In other words, academic misconduct of the highest order, craziness of the highest order. Okay, let's look at the animal-based incidents. We have 832 deaths in the first decile there, and we have 919 in the 10th. So that's, if you do the math for yourself in your own time, that's going to be nothing whatsoever. That's going to be in the tenths of thousandths of incidences per man per year, so forget it. I mean, you multiply that risk, even if it was causal, which it isn't, but let's just imagine for fun that it is. Let's multiply that out over 100 years of follow-up, let alone the 20 that were actually undertaken, and it's still so close to zero as makes no odds for any given man. So there's no reason for any man to adjust their dietary intakes on the basis of that study at all. Okay, no reason to avoid animal products given there. Sorry. A vegetable-based diet score for men. In the first decile, we have 1,095 deaths, and in the 10th decile, we have 721 deaths. Let's do some math. Okay. So, in the first case, we had 1,095 deaths. We're going to divide that by 89,096 man years, and that will give us an incidence of 0.012. Okay. Now we're going to look at the 10th decile, and we're going to go 721 divided by 89,096 man years, and that gives us 0.008. So the difference is 4 per 1,000 man years of follow-up there. And it's adjusted. So it's a fabrication. That in terms of the risk ratios that they've given. In terms of the absolute outcomes, I've just given you the answer. The difference is 4 incidences per 1,000 years of follow-up. So divide it by 10 for a 100-year lifespan for any one given individual, and it's 4 out of 10,000. Divide that by 5, because we've actually only followed them for 20 years. We've got nothing at all. And you'll find the same thing is applicable to the data for the women, because women and men are not particularly all that much different in terms of how they've responded here. So what we actually have here, boys and girls, is a bunch of pseudo-scientific crackpottery of the highest order. We have a bunch of people with an agenda trying to push that agenda by presenting only relative outcome statistics instead of telling us what the absolute outcomes were, thus to obfuscate and to avoid their responsibility to place their own findings in a context in terms of what was the meaning for any one given person. Should any one given person change their diet on the basis of these findings? The answer is absolutely not. There is nothing here that would be of any utility to any given living human being over 20 years, 26 years, or even over 100. Because the findings are so close to zero as makes absolutely no difference. Even if you falsely imagine these associative findings to be causal and you ignore the total lack of measurement of actual intakes because of the assumptions made by these ridiculous authors in their ridiculous pseudoscientific paper. Goodness me, who feels a bit cross about that? Or who in fact feels full of delight that they can now go back to their vegan apologetic friends and say, you need to watch this video where this actual scientist pulls this paper absolutely to pieces and puts it into its actual context using actual statistical inference, actual mathematics, and actual common sense for once. There we go. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was of some value to you. Stick around the channel. A lot more of this kind of thing will be coming along down the pipe as we get rolling with this channel. Do feel free to subscribe to this fine channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so that YouTube can completely fail to advise you when I post material. And also do leave me some comments underneath the video, interact with the video. And also, if you'd be so kind, it would be very nice if you would share this video to the homepage or the feed of all your favorite social media platforms. I appreciate that very much. Thank you for your support in that respect. You're very welcome in terms of the material provided to you today, previously, and indeed going forward in the future. In the meantime, continue to enjoy your meat. Not so much on the potatoes, though. Okay, see you then.